I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I can't even tell you when Kevin Nguyen and I met. It was like 19 jobs ago when we were introduced by a mutual friend in publishing, and I can also say I don't remember exactly when he told me he was writing this new novel, My Documents. You might know New Waves. You certainly know his byline from GQ and The Verge and some other places. National Magazine finalist. There's been a lot of finalists for stuff. I'm waiting for you to actually get your due. So we're going to stay spoiler free in this conversation. And I really want to start with, this wasn't the book you meant to, you'd started writing a different book and it turned into this.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Yeah, originally, I just been doing a lot of reading about Japanese internment or Japanese incarceration during World War II, kind of since college, partly because I got all the way to college before I had ever even heard of Japanese internment. We did like an entire year of World War II in high school, and Japanese internment never got mentioned. And even to that point, I took a 20th century American history class, and I think the unit on the Vietnam War was 2 days. And I know everyone's curriculum is different state by state. I just remember in college, like encountering this and just being like, I cannot believe that we just locked up, however, 100,000 Japanese Americans on the basis of race. And so I thought, well, that's also like a really fertile place to set a novel. So originally, I was doing some research, thinking, oh, this would be a great scenario for that. But Juliet Tsuka exists and has done some of the finest fiction about Japanese incarceration. And then I kind of came up with a kind of more contemporary idea of like, what if it happened an echo? I always call it like an echo of Japanese incarceration. What if that happened today? And it would obviously be very scary, very haunting. But there are also kind of funny things about imagining that, like imagining 20-year-olds getting sent to camp in the desert and their first concern would be like, how do I live without the internet?
Yeah. We're going to stick to a small section of your cast, right? Like there are a lot of folks in this book that I am extremely fond of, but we're going to keep it to a set of half siblings. And Ursula, who's based in New York, who becomes a journalist. Her sister Jeanne, who's sent to camp, half sister. And then there's Alvin, and I'm suddenly blanking. Alvin is Ursula's full sibling or Jen's full sibling? Ursula's full sibling. Okay. A couple of things listeners need to know. Ursula passes for white, even though she's mixed. And Alvin is working for a giant company that keeps him out in the world and free, and then he does something goofy. And I'm still kind of amazed that Alvin didn't see the consequences coming, but okay, my guy. You have them... Their dad. I guess we do have to talk about Dan, don't we? I think we have to talk about Dan a little bit. Dan's the reason they're all in the States. Dan's the reason they're half siblings. Dan's the reason they're not all... Dan's complicated. It's hard to have a complicated dad.
It is. I think partly... So Dan is, he's the kind of guy that has started many families, and abandoned many families. And so I guess, you might call him like a deadbeat dad. And, I will say I'm Vietnamese American. I have a lot of Vietnamese American friends with fathers who are kind of similarly minded. It was interesting. I felt like I was reading a lot of novels where dads were kind of like these stoic, immovable characters. I was wondering, like, how can I take like a deadbeat dad character and at least like complicate him? I don't think the book lets him off the hook for any of his behaviors or how he treats his family, but I think there's like an understanding of the way he sees the world, and so that was like a fun challenge as a character portrait.
Anytime someone wants to play with the model minority, image, myth, whatever we call it, I mean, it's a thing that just makes I cannot stand it. I cannot stand anything about it. I cannot stand that it was created outside of the community and the community embraced it. I'm just like, what is happening here? And so anytime we get a set of characters like you've given us in My Documents, I am always delighted because not one of these people is perfect.
Yeah, I think in sort of a blunt way, several of the characters kind of represent like different beliefs in the model minority, which they learn to realize is quite false. But yeah, Ursula is like very career minded. Alvin, her brother, he's trying to pursue also a career, but as a software engineer at Google. One of the most lucrative jobs you can have, one of the most prestigious jobs you could theoretically have. And then yeah, their half sibling Jen is she's a freshman at NYU, so there's like lots of academic pressure there. And the way the book starts, it's like they have their very narrow, small lives, and all of them get all their lives get blown up by the introduction of this policy that incarcerates many Vietnamese Americans.
But Ursula isn't just career minded. She's working in the media. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite pieces of the novel where you're just playing. I mean, you and I have both seen massive changes in the media business certainly in the last decade, but it started well before then.
Yeah.
And again, like, you've worked at GQ, you've worked at The Verge, you've worked at Google. I am going to sit with that for a second. But the idea that the media isn't what it was, I'm not saying that we need to go back to the era of Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw or, Connie Chung and Diane Sawyer. Those monolithic media moments don't exist anymore either, although they were useful in some ways. And now we just have this weird splintering of stuff. It's a mess. It's a mess.
It's definitely a mess. I mean, the upside of the era of like, Connie Chung and Walter Cronkite was, that they were, well, maybe the downside is like there were just more gatekeepers, right? Like the number of places you get your news was much more limited. It was like a handful of newspapers and, like the nightly TV news. With the internet, like those gatekeepers are gone, right? There are fewer and fewer barriers to just putting whatever you want on the internet. On one hand, like the upside is like it's way easier to write and publish stories that you might not have heard otherwise. Whether it's about communities that like don't get enough representation in the media, or I don't know, things from local sources that just like don't reach the level of newspapers. The flip side is that anyone can put whatever they want on the internet and it all looks the same, right? We call it misinformation. So yeah, the book is, it's definitely about our media moment, but also I think kind of the warped incentives around it as well.
I mean, I grew up Japanese American in New England. And I can promise you the adults around me got an earful when, as an adolescent, I learned about all of this stuff. And the most common refrain I got initially was, well, we didn't know. And I said, well, you know now. And I was probably like 11 or 12. Filled with scorn for my adults. And then, if you think back on it too, like Cronkite is in many ways responsible for the Americans' turn against the Vietnam War, when it's constant footage of American soldiers coming back in caskets. And that's really when American sentiment against the war turned against the war. I look at moments like Watergate and what the Washington Post did with Watergate, and it's like, it's not how newspapers operate anymore. That's good to know.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously my background is in journalism. So I'm thinking about a lot of this stuff. It's also just interesting, like the mechanics of journalism, like the way it's set up. Like, I never want to say this too loudly because I think, obviously as a journalist, I want sources to talk to journalists. There's no, this free press thing does not work without that relationship. But I think, even in the media, we don't interrogate enough just how much power the journalist has over a source in that moment. And that like ends up becoming like a pretty strong dynamic in the book. Yeah, I don't think it gives too much away to just like say that Ursula, who's the journalist character, like her siblings start becoming her sources for things.
Yeah.
And they suffer more of the consequences of that than, and actually Ursula only stands to gain from that. So it's like, what happens when you tell your family's story and you're the one that like almost literally profits from it.
And man, she profits. She gets all of the things that a writer would hope for. And on top of it, she gets off the beauty beat.
Yes.
Which, no disrespect to people who cover the beauty beat, because there is interesting journalism that comes out of that, but it is not what she wants to do.
Yeah. She starts at this website called Top Story, which, you can probably tell that in an earlier draft, this website was named BuzzFeed.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because when I was writing it, BuzzFeed represented like a very specific thing. There were a lot of people that thought the future of media was BuzzFeed.
Oh, I remember. I
And
remember.
we have friends that were there. But yeah, there was just, and then I think that the kind of underrated thing about BuzzFeed is they had this really tremendous news arm. It did really great. 'Cause I think people now, they're like, oh, BuzzFeed, it was just lists. Like, it was a lot of lists, but they actually had this like kind of isolated newsroom. Was really doing a lot of incredible reporting. And so when I was writing the book, that dynamic was still, it was kind of ending. I think the BuzzFeed News era was ending, but there was a moment where like it felt like it could be the future of media.
Well, they were winning Pulitzers. I mean, Vice magazine had a moment where it was doing actual journalism.
Yeah.
And I remember being shocked because I remember seeing the initial version of the magazine and thinking, who are these clowns? Like, what? Oh, congratulations. Like, now the boys have something besides Maxim. Because really, that's what Vice started as.
Yeah.
Was like, hey, you know, Maxim, all of that kind of lad magazine stuff. And then they got real for a minute, and then they imploded and went bankrupt, and I think maybe sold for parts. I don't even remember what happened to them.
I feel like Vice has imploded and restarted like 4 times since I've been in this industry. It's probably back. We just don't know.
But I want to stay with Ursula for a second because, I mean, she's got her sibling relationship. She has big older sister energy.
Mm-hmm.
I will own that. Game recognizes game. I will totally own it. I have a younger brother who, you know, is an actual functioning adult. And sometimes I forget that because, you know, I remember when you were eating sand on the beach. But the family dynamic, these siblings are my favorite of all the siblings. I mean, there are some other folks in the background who readers will meet, but when did you know that these were the siblings? I mean, I know because you start with all these big ideas. You can't have the big ideas and no people.
Yeah, I think you know, like the conceit of the book is like, and it's like all the marketing, right, is about how it's like, oh, what if, you know, Vietnamese Americans were incarcerated? But I really think more than anything, it's like actually a family story. Like it is about how these people move through that scenario more than it is about the setup of the scenario itself. They're not directly based on my cousins, but I do have like a bunch of young cousins, and they live here in New York actually, and I'm like about 10 years older than all of them, so it's fun watching them grow up. And I love writing characters who are in their 20s. I think that's like actually when you figure out like who you're going to be. Have all these weird incentives on top of you. Like work warps your brain a lot. That's like quite a bit of what my first book is about. But I love that as like an inflection point. You're in your early 20s and you're kind of figuring out if you're going to be like a good person or not. Not that it's so black and white, but yeah, but all my cousins, who I love dearly, they're just like always so annoyed with each other. And they like are annoying, but they also love each other so deeply. And I just feel like that's like the purest distillation of family. It's like the people who can drive you up a wall that you love the most.
It is. It's also fun, though, when you add on that whole identity piece, right? Like, I mean, we talk about Asian America, and it's like, well, actually, not a monolith. You know, yeah, I'm Japanese American. I'm also Taiwanese American, which that in and of itself, it's its own combination. Hello, colonialism. But I love the idea that these kids have a chance to figure out their sort of messy selves, right? That there is no expectation. Yeah, even their parents, though, are not doing the whole, of course, you're going to go be mathematicians and optometrists and consultants and accountants and all of that kind of stuff. It's really refreshing to see the parents just be like, okay,
yeah, like I do think, you know, there are some, the book is a bit about assimilation and kind of like the false promise of it. But yeah, it's obviously, it's boring to write characters that play into stereotype. You know, like I feel like the fun of writing fiction is coming up with characters that you haven't met before. And I don't know. I don't think you've met these characters before.
Oh, I haven't. And you know how much I read, and I know how much you read, and that's part of. I will say I've read my documents a couple of times, and obviously I've read New Waves, and you know that was when did 2020 was New Waves?
March of 2020.
Oh yeah, perfect time. That's what it was. Okay, perfect timing. Although this new paperback package is pretty spiff. I think this is kind of great.
I like that cover more actually.
Yeah, the hardcover jacket was never quite what I was hoping for. And I remember when you told me about my documents and what you were doing, and I thought, oh God, that's great. That's subversive. That's so wild. That's so fresh. And here we are taping in March of 2025, and the world feels different. There were a couple of times I had to put stuff down, and wander off and get a snack and come back, because I was just like, this is poking at me in ways that fiction should. I mean, you also introduced some characters where I was like, yep, fine. I totally understand. And yes, it's great and organic, but this dude, Dennis, I'm looking at you. How did writing this book change you?
Yeah, it's funny because when I set out to write the book, especially when I realized I wanted to do something, some people have been calling it like speculative fiction. I don't think that's like an inaccurate term, but you just have to remember like all it took for Japanese incarceration to happen was like one policy, invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, and an executive order. But I always imagined this book. It's like, okay, it'll be close to our reality, but a heightened one. And I, based a lot of what's in the book, like kind of an amalgamation of Japanese incarceration and migrant detention centers, which are very much happening today. Yeah, and now, like, in this moment, I'm like, maybe I should have heightened it a little further. It just feels a little too close. And, like, our current president is constantly invoking the Alien Enemies Act. So we are just inching closer to things like what are in the book.
It's been really interesting watching folks learn about the Alien Enemies Act, or EO 9066, which had its 80th anniversary last month.
Yeah. I mean, to your point earlier, like you learned about Japanese incarceration, you said when like 11 or 12. Like, how did you encounter it?
It wasn't because of school. I read Farewell to Manzanar. I was just a kid who read a lot. I was in the public library. I picked up a book and I said, well, that woman kind of looks like someone I might... Because also, when I was an adolescent, people like me were not on books.
Right.
And so I started reading and I was like, I'm sorry, what is happening here? And then I started poking at, my parents' friends and my parents and saying, excuse me. And for a long time, too, the literature didn't really exist. It was a lot of self-published poetry, a couple of histories that were self-published. Now, most of it is reverted rights to academic presses. So thank you, university presses, for keeping that. Reading a lot about the Asian American power movement in the early 70s, too, that brought a lot of it. And basically, I had to educate myself.
Yeah.
I mean, no one was going to teach me about it in school. And then at some point, 60 Minutes did a piece. And there was a biracial Japanese-American man who was like, I didn't understand, because honestly, he looked like a white guy to me. And he was interviewed and he was saying, well, I don't know why they sent me. I mean, his mother, I think, was Japanese-American. And he was just like, I don't know why they sent me. And he's crying on television. I'm looking at this going, I don't understand so it started as, I don't understand. And if no one's going to tell me, I'm going to figure it out. And this is pre-internet, so you couldn't just jump on and Google. And it wasn't, though, until, I think it was 2017 or 2018, or maybe even 19, that I went to Manzanar for the first time. And I'm assuming you went, because, I mean, there are a couple of references to Independence, California, and I'm like, oh, here we are.
Actually, I never went.
Oh, seriously? You should go sometime. I know. Listen, Death Valley, you can go hiking in Death Valley, clear your head. There's also a museum of movies because a lot of films were shot in and around Death Valley. So, like, even part of Star Wars was shot in the Alabama hills.
Makes sense.
So it's a very unsettling experience. But yeah, you should go sometime. I mean,
it's good to know you thought I went because but a lot of it is just research. And then I was planning a trip, but then I thought about it, and like, especially as I was not, heightened reality. So I was like, maybe we should have, I just didn't want the reality of it to affect too much more. When people haven't heard of Japanese incarceration, like, I also kind of understand, because if you don't get taught it in school, like, how are you just going to encounter this out in the world? And obviously, art is a way that you learn about a lot of these things. Like, you discovered at the library. That's amazing, actually. It's more reason that, like, I should just put Julia Tsuka books everywhere.
Yeah, right.
Also because they're like fantastic, for one. But two, you'll learn about this history that gets left out of your, high school textbooks, and increasingly so probably. But yeah, and then the book is kind of about how the main characters have also never really encountered this before.
Yeah, Alvin. Oh, Alvin.
And then even then too, like there's a bit about, so the characters are Vietnamese American, but they don't really know anything about the Vietnam War, um, which I think speaks to like a deep in curiosity in like this younger generation. But even if you did want to learn that history, it's more complicated than being able to like ask your parents. Like
Yeah.
personally, like my parents did not talk about being refugees for a very long time. They're talking about it more now, in the past decade. But for most of for 30 years, they didn't say anything about this in a meaningful way. So it's just like I think they have personal reasons for not wanting to talk about it.
Yeah.
But also, like, what did I lose by not hearing about it sooner? But also, it's also their right to not talk about it.
I think, too, so much of the history of the Vietnam War was written by white men. I mean, listen, Halberstam, still one of the best in the business. Like, if you are going to go back, or white women, Frances Fitzgerald, same thing, Fire in the Lake, like, amazing. There are pieces of journalism that will continue. And Gloria Emerson did some great reporting out of Vietnam. I mean, we got some great, serious nonfiction out of it. But in terms of writing from either Vietnamese Americans or Vietnamese, it really, obviously, Viet Thanh Nguyen turned the tide with The Sympathizer and The Committed and his memoir, Man of Two Faces.
We're talking about, like, this is work that has, like, arrived in the past decade.
Exactly.
We're talking 40 years after the
right.
That we're only now finally in English getting any kind of perspective. And the other thing, too, is, like, I'm a little younger than Viet, but like even Viet is like a generation removed from, so like, yeah, like what did we lose in that time? Like what were the stories that we could have had that didn't get published?
The Vietnam War also defined a lot of experience for Asian Americans who are not Vietnamese American. I can promise you I had neighbors who did not know that Japanese and Vietnamese do not sound the same. I can promise you. And also, very well-intentioned, nice people, all of that. I mean, no one was... But I can promise you they did not. And they don't sound anything alike.
Yeah, they definitely don't sound alike. I don't know, it's also just interesting thinking about the way that the U.S. still thinks about the Vietnam War. And it's always very frustrating to me when people say Vietnam. They associate that with, like, an armed conflict and not a country of people.
Yeah. Oh, and all the movies? Oh, remember that movie moment where I was like, why? Like, we went, and I understand. There are lots of different ways to process things, but there was that moment where every young white male actor had to make a Vietnam movie, and it was like, okay. It was wild. But I want to go back to the Vietnam War. I really like so much of this. If you think about music, if you think about Tim O'Brien, I mean, the things they carried. Actually, there's this fabulous new novel called Oh Sinners. You share a publisher with Nicole Cuffy.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Her novel, which actually just recently published as well, bounces back and forth between Black soldiers in Vietnam and the present day. And there's a little interlude in Texas. And listening to her talk about how she did her research and everything, I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, I might be a little bit older than you.
It's funny, my dad showed me a lot of Vietnam War movies when I was young.
Yeah.
And my parents had a strict, like, you're not allowed to watch things that are rated R. My dad made an exception for these Vietnam War movies. And I thought, oh, like, maybe this is his way of, like, trying to show us a little bit of our history, even though the films are, like, very much from the Americans' perspective. I remember asking him about it, like, kind of like years later. I was like, oh, was this sort of a way to talk about it? And he was like, oh, no, I just really like war movies.
Okay, fair.
Like, oh, I thought you were doing a thing, and it's like, nope, he just wanted to watch Platoon again.
I saw Platoon in a movie theater, like on a big screen. And, you know, it was the era when you were a teenager, like you went to the movies a lot as a teenager, because it's kind of the thing you could do with your friends, right? And it wasn't that I didn't like it. I mean, I just remember thinking, oh, of course I went to see Platoon because everyone's seeing it, everyone's talking, like, it's a cultural moment. Of course I'm going to go see it. And then I watched it again like 10 or 15 years later, and I was so mad. I was just so mad. I was like, why did I do that again? It could have just stayed in my teenage memories. Like, why? I had so many issues with start to finish, in between, and then some, and I was like, why did I do that to myself?
I mean, the funny thing is, like, I think we've, on some level, of like, we've moved on from thinking of the Vietnam War as a thing that only affected America. Like, I think the Ken Burns documentary from about a decade ago was quite good at showing both the North and the South Vietnamese perspective. Like this year, Apple put out a Vietnam War documentary, a little series called Vietnam: The War That Changed America. And I was like, I cannot believe we are still doing this in 2025. We're on the 50-year anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and we're still talking about this thing as if, like how America lost its innocence, which is such a boring narrative, I know like the failure narratives out there, but like everything changed in the US, like it just like drives me nuts. And so, my document is like a bit of a refutation of that.
Yeah, I'm just going to sit here and roll my eye. I'm hoping, if you're not watching the video, I hope you can hear my eyes rolling on the air, because I really just, there's so many things that we can, so many moments now, so many moments from the War on Terror, so many moments from, multiple administrations in this country where I sort of feel like they're still responding to Vietnam.
Mm.
We've never actually looked at the human cost, right? Like, we've looked at it from a purely academic, we've looked at a standpoint, we've looked at it from a purely political history standpoint. We've just never looked at the human cost. And if you look at where Vietnamese American community, like Houston, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the shrimp boats, or San Jose, and like the community, like where these communities build up, and what people in the communities end up doing, it's all just so very American.
American for one. I think also one thing that I kind of prod. I'm actually curious what you think, Miwa. Like, one thing the book prods at a little bit is like the reality of like Asian American solidarity,
right?
And I think on some level, like, it is like solidarity is like always useful, but then like how big do you want the tent to be, and at what point is it too big and you lose sight of the things you have in common. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting about Vietnamese Americans is there were basically like no Vietnamese people in the U.S. before the war.
Right.
The Refugee Act made it pretty easy to immigrate, which is unusual. We don't do that, for Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, where the U.S. has had a strong hand in causing the refugee crisis. Kind of, there's a funny thing where like the waves of immigration for Vietnamese Americans are all quite similar, whereas like, Japanese American or Taiwanese American, like there are many different waves of immigration there. So you might meet a Japanese American whose family has been here for 5 generations, and you might meet someone that has only been here 1 generation, and that's a wildly different experience.
And I think too, geopolitics plays into it too. I've had, Chinese Americans say to me, well, you're Chinese American. I'm like, actually, no, thank you. Part Taiwanese. And then you get a little kerfluffle, and I'm like, well, you can process that however you'd like, but no, Taiwanese. And it's been kind of cool, actually, watching this idea of a Taiwanese American community come together. Like, we have, you and I live in a place where we have great Taiwanese food. There is much more of sort of a pop cultural kind of Taiwanese American moment happening. And when I was a kid, that was just not the case. And again, plenty of people saying, well, you're Chinese. No, actually, I'm just from Boston, but also, and then I do the, Japanese and Taiwanese, and then people kind of, I get the RCA dog tilted the head or a raised eyebrow or something, and I'm like, so about that, maybe you've never read about the history of Taiwan, but let me fill you in on some stuff. And the idea, though, that Alvin and Ursula and Jen don't really have a handle on their history, and that their dad, Dan, is kind of like, oh, I want no part of that history. I mean, you give Dan quite a backstory, which I really do appreciate, but it's so hard for me to imagine not knowing my history, right? Like, And I say that as a person who grew up outside of Boston. Like, I know Revolutionary War history and I know Civil War. Like, I get it. I have walked the Freedom Trail multiple times. I have been to Plymouth Plantation more times than I can count. Like, to be that separated from any of your history, to me, is like denying yourself something kind of cool and interesting and complicated.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things you kind of take for granted in your youth, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, like most kids are not as precocious as you and like finding, Harold and Manzanar in the library at age 11. And I guess, I increasingly in the era of the internet, that's kind of the weird irony of the internet. Like we have more access to information than ever before, and people are somehow becoming less and less curious. Like we don't take advantage of this wealth of information at all. So on one hand, the book is a little critical of where the characters start, but I think it's also kind of understanding of if you don't get that history from your family, if you don't get that history from school, like
Mm-hmm.
where else should you find it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess in the book they have to experience it firsthand. So.
Well, yeah, but I come back to Alvin.
Mhm.
Little brother Alvin. Little brother Alvin, who might be brilliant in a lot of other ways, but can Alvin actually make ice? I mean, seriously, like, can he make ice, or does he need the door thing to make the ice? I have a friend whose dad, we used to say he can't make ice, and I sort of feel like Alvin's that guy.
Yeah, I mean, you alluded to, I worked at Google, like, very briefly for, like,
yeah. I remember.
And there was just a very common type of software engineer that I encountered often, and yeah, like, I don't think these guys could make ice, you know? Google is a really funny place because a lot of the engineers are hired right out of college. The campus of Google, well, they call it a campus, it resembles college. There's laundry on site. So it just like these kids, like they never leave college.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they also, I also think like a pretty formative experience of young adulthood is like worrying about money. And these are kids that like never have to worry about money and which, good for them. But also I think they've been deprived of being forced to grow up.
I mean, sometimes you see this too with graduate students, right? The ones that go straight from undergrad to grad and there's no stop in between and you're just kind of like, oh, hot, okay. Oh.
Yeah.
It's that. It's also, or I look at things like AI and listen, I'm not a Luddite. I get that AI is here, but AI is only as good as the people who program it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've lived in a bubble your entire existence, got to tell you, chasing down other people's books and using them to train AI tells me more about you than you think it does. And none of it is flattering. So,
yeah, it's also like we were talking earlier about like wanting to read about new characters. And it's like read what AI makes. Like it definitionally will never give you a new character.
No, it can't. It can't.
Like it can't, but also like it won't, and it is designed not to.
But also place. I mean, and it's partially because I don't know how I would feel about the camp in my documents if I had not been to Manzanar, but that's a lot of dirt to get up your nose. Also, I had seen the Ansel Adams photographs. Really weird to be standing in front of stuff that you have seen, for years. And Dorothea Day also, there is a book of her photographs, actually, from Manzanar as well. And it's really, to be standing in front of something that you've seen as a black and white photograph is wildly disconcerting.
Yeah, were her photographs as beautiful as the Ansel Adams ones?
No.
Because that's the thing about, he sent Ansel Adams to like take these beautiful photographs of camp, basically as propaganda.
Yeah.
And so actually like, yeah, for listeners, like the cover photograph that's used is an Ansel Adams photo of, I think it's a Manzanar, actually. Now I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it is, just based on what I know.
Like, if you look at the original photo, it's just like, it just looks like a calm, beautiful mountain range, and there's like some people in the distance and a car, and it's just like a total betrayal of the reality of what's happening.
You know Giant Robot, right?
Yeah.
So there was this great 30th anniversary, like this giant, beautiful compendium.
I bought that.
Yeah. Well, everyone should buy that book. It's beautiful. But also there's a photograph from early on in the magazine's history, and one of the founders is actually he's dropping off his skateboard off of the monument in the graveyard at Manzanar. And I still love that photo. It is one of the greatest photos I've ever seen. And I don't know who shot it or like, and they did it at a point before, I think, the sort of, now you go and it's very clearly a national park. They, of course, have had to replace the sign multiple times because apparently people use it for target practice. And I'm like, I don't understand the point of that, but okay. But this photograph, it is glorious, this photograph of this dude on a board just dropping down. And you're like, okay, skate the monument. I mean, it's, yeah, I do. It's a great photograph.
Giant Robot. It's like so Giant Robot was like an Asian American magazine in the, I guess, late 90s, early aughts. And I don't have things like that anymore.
We don't. It was very punk rock. It was very like, this model minority stuff is not interesting. Why are we doing this stuff? And it feels like there's that vibe sort of coursing through the back of stuff. Ursula and Jeanne may not know it, but certainly Jeanne is in a place where Giant Robot would have been part of the ethos. But Jeanne's playing with underground media, and Jeanne is she's also writing she's doing the split between the official camp newspaper and an underground publication, and it's kind of fun watching her figure out what her voice is going to say.
Yeah, it's fun. The engine of the book is sort of this like disconnection between Ursula and Jeanne, and we sort of mentioned earlier, like, while inside camp, Jeanne works at the propaganda paper, and then her and a colleague at the propaganda paper start their own sort of dissenting underground publication. So yeah, the story is a lot about the mechanisms of journalism, but more importantly, the mechanisms of storytelling and how those incentives get warped, and also like who gets to tell what story. And so yeah, there's just been like a lot of fun stuff to play with. But to your point, like Jeanne is doing Giant Robot, but in camp.
I'm hoping that helps people come to Giant Robot. I mean, the magazine itself is no longer published, but
I mean, that big book is like, it's so cool. It's just like
it's beautiful.
Of everything.
Yeah,
and,
it's beautiful.
I like really hope to do that for just like more magazines in general.
I would love to see magazines come back. I mean, there was also a magazine in the 70s called Ghidra.
I don't know this one.
Yeah, someone tried to bring it back pre-pandemic, and they were sort of making colored, like a physical print, but I think it lasted maybe a couple of issues. It wasn't even perfect bound. It was literally like one of those brass pins in the corner. I'll see. I might still have I'll dig it up and I'll pass it off to you the next time I see you in real life. Influences, though, because we are bumping up against time. Obviously, journalism has been a big piece of your development as a writer, but you and I have also had very long-running conversations about writers. So let's do the quick version of top influences, not just for this book. I'm talking about you as a stylist.
I think a lot about structure. I think that's like the most compelling part of writing fiction to me. So actually, maybe kind of surprisingly, originally I had kind of modeled what I wanted the book to be around Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, which is like, it is largely vignettes of different length that kind of eventually like tell you a broader story. So I kind of had this idea before I had former characters that like, that is how the structure of this would be. And then I completely changed it. And I was reading Leave the World Behind, I think. Must have been the pandemic.
Yeah.
There's not that much that's similar, except that like Rumaan, who's great, all his chapters were just like sub 1,000 words long.
Yeah.
And there was just like the momentum it created between point of view characters. I just like loved so much. Like I whipped through that book in an evening, and I wanted to write something that people would read quite quickly as well. So structurally, that was super helpful. Yeah, I think those are kind of the two most obvious ones. You and I, we get along because I think we both read quite widely. And I don't know. So there's obviously a lot of influences in the book, but those are probably like the most discrete ones I can think of.
Discreet, yeah, but I think there's also a little bit of Jennifer Egan in there. There's a little bit of Goon Squad. There's a little bit of Candy House in there. There's a little bit of, I mean, you're very wry on the page, and I think that comes out of the journalism stuff, though, because I mean, you just like, you see all of this stuff that you see, and then you're like, are you kidding me? But the dialogue is really good. The dialogue is really like, Yeah, the dialogue is definitely, you don't waste it, right? Like, and I'm also thinking of some very specific scenes in camp and where things could have been a little mustache twirling, and that's not at all what happens. No, I listen, I props to Dennis. I am delighted that I only met him on the page, but at the same time, like, he's kind of the perfect embodiment of what that kind of character should be, and what he believes and what he's doing, and yeah, I mean, honestly, delighted I don't know him in real life, but
yeah. You know, mechanically, it's funny you bring up dialogue. I feel like the way I think about dialogue has changed quite a bit ever since I did some TV writing. It's obviously a different world, and you know, for many reasons, there's a kind of economy way dialogue functions there. And so that's not like always what I'm doing in the book, but it's like every time there's a quote, like it has to like move something forward, or it has to like a new texture that cannot be paraphrased. And yeah, and that comes a little bit out of like some of the rules of magazine writing too. But yeah, writing dialogue is the fun part.
I think all of it was the fun part, except for the, putting Vietnamese Americans in camps. But even then, honestly, it's like, that's what we're supposed to be able to do with literature, right? Like, I don't actually want to live through the apocalypse, but.
But it is nice to imagine like how we might survive if we did have to live through the apocalypse. Because in the end of the day, like a lot of the characters in the book are quite resilient, and the ways they survive and adapt have a lot to do with like the art they create.
Yeah. Oh, Tom and his movie. Oh, so good. And that's like a page. That's like a page, and it changes the way Jen sees everything, and it's great. And just the way it's done, and it's just, a page and a half at most.
Yeah, maybe a page and a half.
Okay, but I mean, and just the setup, and Jen's kind of like, what? And then Jen really, great. Yeah, but why can't we, like, if you can't talk about the joy, and like, there's a set of Kodachrome slides that University of North Carolina printed from the camps, and I'm blanking on the title. This is so bad of me, but it's a trip to see kids playing baseball and like celebrating Obon and like, playing hopscotch and all in color.
Yeah,
that's the thing where it's like the Kodachromes where you're just like, oh.
Well, that's like another reality. Like, you can, obviously, like, there were a lot of things that were not great happening in camps, Japanese people, but also like they were still, they were writing their own newsletters. Like they were writing poems, they were having baseball leagues or football leagues, and that's just, I think it's just disingenuous to just describe, Japanese incarceration as if it was just like people who were just sad for 3.5 years. It's just like so much more complicated than that. And I don't know, I maybe self-servingly just believe that like art does sustain us. And in those situations, I think it like matters the most.
I think it does. And if you look at the body of work, there are watercolors that have come out of the camps. There are black and white stories. I mean, John Okada's No Boy is something that absolutely everyone should read. And it is about the war resistors who were literally in camps. And the American government was like, hey, go fight in World War II. And they're like, sorry, what? I'm sorry. Like Daniel Inouye, the senator from Hawaii, like he ended up with his hand and arm. He was at the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, bad things happened there.
Japanese Americans to
the 442nd.
Yeah. So
I do believe that art gets us through a lot. I genuinely believe books get us through a lot. I genuinely believe, though, that we also need to know our history. We need to not lose sight of where we've come from. And I think that, you don't really get to move forward unless you understand what's behind you and what's next to you and what's, maybe a foot in front of you as opposed to 5 years in the future.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise, well, I don't know. I don't know if we can prevent history from repeating itself, but at least we can identify that like the terror that we face is something that we have faced before.
Yeah, I would like it to be a little less familiar.
It is funny, yeah. We were talking about the Alien Enemies Act earlier, and it's like I was on the New York Times homepage like maybe this morning or yesterday, and there just was an explainer of like, what is the Alien Enemies Act? And I was like, I'm glad that we're putting that front and center in people, and I'm just a little sad that people don't already know.
Yeah. Yeah. But I will say, you've written a very funny book. I really love these characters. You do some stuff. You do some stuff in this book. And I'm really hoping people pick it up in ways... I'm hoping they give it space, right? And they give it room to breathe, because it's very funny. It's very, very funny. It's very wry. It's all of the things you kind of want from a novel that's going to push you in a direction that you might not have planned to go.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I've had obviously a hard time. Like, I described the concept of the book to people, and they're like, "Oh, that sounds so dark." And it's like, the book actually isn't that. There's dark things that happen, but yeah, it's like, it's a family story. So like, as like emotional as it can be, it is also just like about family members like driving each other up a wall. And I think that stuff's always fun.
Yeah, it is inherently funny. So I think that's where we get to say, okay, this was really cool. I'm so glad we got to do this.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Hey, listen, we've been talking about doing this basically since you told me about this book, because the show didn't exist when New Waves came out.
Yeah.
It didn't even exist. So, I mean, here we are almost 500 something episodes later. You might be close to, by the time this airs, you might be like 550 or something. Oh, wow. Anyway, on that note, Kevin, it was really good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.